Imagine a respected member of your community, someone you've known your whole life, someone you've trusted, turned out to be hiding a dark, deadly secret. How would you feel if you learned that the person responsible for a tragedy was someone you thought you could trust? This is the story of Jacquelyn Hayes, whose murder was forgotten by all but her grieving family. The shocking truth? The person who killed her had been right in front of them all along. This is the story of justice, betrayal, and a community turned upside down. For 50 years, Jacquelyn Hayes' case went unsolved. Her murder was a mystery that haunted her family and a small town. But what happened next would shock everyone. Stay tuned to uncover how a DNA breakthrough finally brought her killer to justice. Before we dive deeper into this chilling case, hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell. This story is one you don't want to miss. The sun rose over Maplewood, Michigan, on what should have been an unremarkable Tuesday morning in September 1970. The town of 6,000 souls hummed with its usual rhythm, storefronts opening, coffee brewing at the corner diner, children walking to school under oak trees that had witnessed generations of small-town life. But beneath that calm surface, something had already gone terribly wrong. Jacquelyn Hayes was 22 years old, a medical student at Maplewood University with a scholarship that represented everything her working-class parents had dreamed of for their only daughter. She carried herself with quiet determination, the kind that made professors remember her name and classmates seek her out for study groups. Her apartment on Birch Street sat just 3 blocks from campus, close enough to walk, far enough to feel independent. That morning, Patricia Collins waited at their usual table in the Maplewood Cafe, watching the door. Patty, as everyone called her, had known Jacquelyn since freshman year. They'd bonded over late-night anatomy cramming sessions and shared frustrations about being 2 of only 5 women in their medical cohort. Their Tuesday breakfast had become ritual, 7:30 sharp, before Jacquelyn's 8 o'clock lecture on cardiovascular systems. 7:45 arrived. No Jacquelyn. Patty felt the first stirring of unease. Jacquelyn was never late. Not to class, not to study sessions, not to breakfast. She ran on precision, always 10 minutes early, always prepared. Patty ordered coffee and waited. 8 o'clock came and went. The waitress refilled her cup with a sympathetic glance. At 8:20, Patty paid and left. The walk to Jacquelyn's apartment took 4 minutes. Patty knocked first, 3 sharp raps that echoed in the empty hallway. Nothing. She knocked again, harder this time, calling Jacquelyn's name. The silence that answered felt wrong, somehow weighted with meaning she couldn't yet understand. The doorknob turned under her hand. Unlocked. Patty pushed the door open slowly, her heart beginning to hammer against her ribs. The apartment looked untouched. Textbooks stacked neatly on the desk. Yesterday's coffee mug still sitting in the sink. The bed made with military corners the way Jacquelyn always did it. But there was an absence here, a hollowness that made Patty's skin crawl. Jacquelyn's purse sat on the kitchen counter, contents visible through the open zipper, wallet, keys, student ID, everything she'd need to leave the apartment. Her coat hung on its hook by the door, her shoes lined up beneath it. No signs of struggle, no overturned furniture, no broken glass, just a terrible, empty stillness. Patty backed out of the apartment and ran. The Maplewood Police Department occupied a brick building on Main Street, sandwiched between the post office and a hardware store. Patty burst through the door, breathless, and demanded to see someone, anyone, about a missing person. The desk sergeant, a heavy-set man named Tom Brewster who'd known Jacquelyn's father since high school, listened with growing concern. Within an hour, 2 officers stood in Jacquelyn's apartment, taking notes and asking questions that had no good answers. How long had she been missing? Could she have left voluntarily? Any boyfriends, any conflicts, any reason she might want to disappear? Patty answered as best she could, but the truth was simple and terrible. Jacquelyn Hayes had vanished between 11 o'clock Monday night, when Patty had called to confirm their breakfast plans and 7:30 Tuesday morning, when she failed to appear. Somewhere in those 8.5 hours, a young woman with a promising future had simply ceased to exist in the space she'd occupied. No note, no warning, no explanation. The officers searched the apartment thoroughly, looking for what they couldn't name. They found Jacquelyn's calendar, marked with exam dates and study sessions. They found her class notes, meticulous and color-coded. They found a half-written letter to her parents, telling them about a recent anatomy exam she'd aced. What they didn't find was Jacquelyn. By Tuesday afternoon, word had spread through Maplewood like smoke. The university activated its emergency notification system, such as it was in 1970, a series of phone calls and announcements in lecture halls. Students who'd seen Jacquelyn the day before came forward with information that led nowhere. She'd been in the library until 9. She'd walked home alone, same as always. Several people had seen her on Birch Street around 9:30, books under her arm, heading toward her apartment. After that, nothing. The Hayes family received the news at their home on the south side of town. Martha Hayes, a third-grade teacher, felt her legs give out beneath her. George Hayes, who'd spent 30 years fixing engines at the local garage, stood frozen, unable to process what the officers were telling him. Their daughter, their brilliant, careful daughter, was missing. By Wednesday morning, search parties combed the woods surrounding Maplewood. Volunteers checked ditches and abandoned buildings. The university closed for the day so students could join the effort. But as each hour passed with no trace, the hope that had driven the search began to curdle into something darker. Where was Jacquelyn Hayes? And if she hadn't left voluntarily, if something terrible had happened to her in her own home with no signs of struggle, no sounds of distress, no witnesses to whatever had occurred, what did that mean for the killer? Someone had made a 22-year-old woman disappear without leaving a single clue behind. Someone who knew how to enter and exit without forcing doors. Someone who could commit an act of violence, because everyone now feared violence, and leave no trace of it in the physical world. Someone who might still be walking the streets of Maplewood, hidden among the faces of the very people searching for Jacquelyn. The investigation had just begun, but already a terrible question hung over the town. If the killer could be anyone, how would they ever find the truth? The weeks following Jacquelyn Hayes' disappearance transformed Maplewood from a quiet college town into a community consumed by questions no one could answer. Detective Samuel Harris had seen his share of missing persons cases in his 19 years with the Michigan State Police, but this one defied every pattern he'd learned to recognize. Harris was methodical by nature, a man who believed every crime left traces if you knew where to look. He'd built his reputation on closing cases that other detectives had given up on, but Jacquelyn's disappearance presented him with a puzzle that seemed to have no edges, no corners, nothing to build from. The apartment on Birch Street had been processed 3 times by forensics teams. They'd dusted every surface, photographed every angle, collected samples from drains and windowsills and floorboards. The results came back with nothing unusual. Jacquelyn's fingerprints where you'd expect them, some partial prints from Patty Collins, a few smudges from the building superintendent who'd done a repair the week before. No foreign DNA, no blood traces, no signs of forced entry or exit. It was as if Jacquelyn had simply chosen to walk out of her life, except everything she'd need to do that remained behind. Harris began with the people closest to her. In cases like these, statistics favored the intimate circle: boyfriends, family members, close friends, someone who had access, opportunity, and motive. Raymond Collins entered the investigation during the second week. He was a 43-year-old professor of English literature at Maplewood University, well regarded in his department, married with 2 teenage children. He also happened to be Patty Collins's uncle, though that connection initially obscured a more troubling one. A student came forward, hesitantly, to report that she'd seen Professor Collins and Jacquelyn leaving the library together late one evening in August. The way they'd walked, close but not touching, the way he'd held the door for her with a lingering glance, it suggested something beyond a faculty-student relationship. When Harris brought Collins in for questioning, The professor's composure cracked within minutes. Yes, he'd been involved with Jacquelyn. It had started in the spring semester when she'd taken his seminar on American Gothic literature. They'd met in his office to discuss her term paper, and the conversations had evolved into something neither of them had planned. He'd ended it in late August, overwhelmed by guilt and fear of losing his family. Jacquelyn had been hurt but understanding. They'd agreed to maintain distance. The affair gave Harris his first real lead. Motive lived in the spaces where relationships ended badly. But Collins's alibi held under scrutiny. The night Jacquelyn disappeared, he'd been at home with his wife and children. His wife confirmed it. The children confirmed it. Neighbors had seen his car in the driveway. Phone records showed no calls made or received from his home line after 9 o'clock. Harris wanted Collins to be guilty. It would have made sense, would have fit the pattern of crimes driven by passion and panic. But the evidence, or lack of it, pointed elsewhere. The investigation spread outward. Harris interviewed Jacquelyn's classmates, her professors, her neighbors. Each conversation added pieces to a portrait of a young woman whose life held no obvious threats. She studied hard. She kept to herself mostly. Friendly, but not social. She dated casually, but nothing serious since arriving at Maplewood. She had no enemies anyone could name. Yet someone had made her disappear. By November, the pressure on Harris intensified. The university's board of trustees wanted assurances that the campus was safe. Parents were pulling their daughters out of school. The local newspaper ran weekly updates demanding answers the police couldn't provide. The Hayes family appeared at every press conference, Martha's face growing more hollow with each passing week, George standing silent beside her, a man aging years and months. Harris pursued leads that dissolved under examination. A suspicious vehicle seen near Jacquelyn's apartment turned out to belong to a textbook salesman, with witnesses placing him 200 miles away that night. An ex-boyfriend from high school, tracked down in Ohio, had a solid alibi and seemed genuinely shaken by the news. A janitor at the university with a prior conviction for burglary had been hospitalized with pneumonia the week Jacquelyn vanished. The detective kept returning to David Bradford, though he couldn't articulate why. Bradford was a high school teacher and coach who'd known Jacquelyn since she was a child. He'd taught her sophomore English when she was 15. He'd coached the girls' track team she'd briefly joined. When Harris interviewed him in October, Bradford had seemed appropriately concerned, offering to help in any way he could. He'd known Jacquelyn as a bright student, he said, someone destined for success. Her disappearance troubled him deeply. Bradford's alibi was thin but not impossible. He lived alone in a house on the edge of town, his wife having left him 2 years earlier. The night Jacquelyn disappeared, he claimed to have been home grading papers. No one could confirm it, but no one could disprove it either. Harris made notes but found no reason to push harder. Bradford was respected in the community, a fixture at school events, a man who dedicated his life to shaping young minds. The investigation began eating itself, circling back over ground already covered, chasing shadows that vanished when examined closely. By December, the daily briefings became weekly. By January, they stopped altogether. Harris refused to close the case officially, but he had nothing new to pursue. The evidence, what little existed, had been analyzed and cataloged and stored. The interviews had been conducted and recorded. The theories had been tested and discarded. Somewhere in Maplewood or beyond it, someone knew what had happened to Jacquelyn Hayes, but that someone had left no trail to follow. The detective understood what civilians didn't, that most cases got solved in the first 48 hours or not at all. After that, memory faded, evidence degraded, witnesses moved away or lost interest. The urgency that drove those first desperate days couldn't be sustained indefinitely. By spring of 1971, Jacquelyn's disappearance had become a file in a cabinet, a cold case waiting for the break that might never come. Harris moved on to other investigations, though Jacquelyn's face remained pinned to the board in his office. He'd failed her. He'd failed her family. He'd failed to see what he'd missed. Years later, he would learn that David Bradford had been in that office, had seen Jacquelyn's photograph, had stood there calmly discussing the case as if he were just another concerned citizen. The teacher had hidden in plain sight, protected by the trust a small town placed in its educators, by the assumption that monsters didn't live among them wearing familiar faces. But in 1971, Harris only knew that he'd lost. The investigation had led nowhere because the person responsible had made certain it would. And somewhere, Jacquelyn Hayes remained missing, her fate unknown, her justice denied. If you're feeling the weight of this unsolved mystery, hit subscribe, because what happens next took 50 years to uncover, and you won't want to miss how technology finally caught a killer who thought he'd gotten away with murder. Time moves differently for those left behind. While Maplewood returned to its rhythms, students graduating, businesses opening and closing, seasons cycling through their predictable patterns, Martha and George Hayes existed in a suspended state, trapped in September 1970, unable to move forward while their daughter remained missing. Martha Hayes had spent 23 years teaching third grade at Oakwood Elementary. She'd shaped hundreds of young minds, watched them grow from uncertain children into confident learners. But after Jacquelyn disappeared, the classroom became a reminder of everything she'd lost. Every child's face reflected the daughter who would never come home. Every parent's smile at pickup time felt like a wound reopening. Still, she returned to work. Not because the pain had lessened, but because Jacquelyn would have wanted her to keep going, and because stopping meant surrendering to the helplessness that threatened to consume her completely. In the evenings, Martha wrote letters. She wrote to the Michigan State Police requesting updates that never came. She wrote to the district attorney's office asking what more could be done. She wrote to local newspapers, ensuring Jacquelyn's name stayed visible, that her daughter didn't become just another forgotten file in a cabinet somewhere. The Maplewood Gazette published her first letter in March 1971, 6 months after Jacquelyn vanished. Martha's words were measured but firm. My daughter Jacquelyn Hayes has been missing for 6 months. The investigation has produced no answers. I am asking the community to remember her, to keep searching, to refuse to accept that a young woman can simply disappear without consequence. The letter generated calls, people offering sympathy, sharing theories, claiming to have seen Jacquelyn in distant cities. Each call required investigation. Each lead dissolved into nothing. But Martha kept writing, kept pushing, kept demanding attention for a case the authorities seemed ready to forget. George Hayes fought differently. He'd spent 32 years at Tucker's Auto Repair, his hands perpetually stained with grease, his reputation built on honest work and fair prices. After Jacquelyn disappeared, he sold his share of the business and retired at 54. Not because he wanted to stop working, but because he needed time for what mattered now, finding out what happened to his daughter. He became a fixture at Murphy's Diner on Main Street, arriving each morning at 7, taking the same corner booth, drinking coffee until the lunch crowd arrived. He'd talk to anyone who'd listen, truck drivers passing through, salesmen stopping for a meal, locals who'd known Jacquelyn. He showed her photograph to strangers, asked if they'd seen her, shared details of the case that the police kept private. Some people thought George had lost touch with reality, that his grief had broken something fundamental in him. But he knew exactly what he was doing. He was keeping Jacquelyn present, making it impossible for Maplewood to move on while his daughter remained missing. If the official investigation had stalled, he'd conduct his own. The Hayes family home on Cicerdale Avenue became a headquarters of sorts. Martha maintained files, newspaper clippings, copies of police reports, notes from every conversation with investigators. She created a timeline on the wall of Jacquelyn's old bedroom, tracking every known movement in the days before the disappearance. She studied maps of Maplewood and the surrounding counties, marking locations where bodies had been found, where missing persons had last been seen. It was methodical, almost clinical, a way of controlling the uncontrollable. George focused on people. He kept a notebook listing everyone who'd known Jacquelyn, classmates, professors, neighbors, childhood friends. He tracked their movements, their current locations, their relationships to his daughter. Some entries had question marks beside them. Others had notes about inconsistencies in their statements to police. David Bradford's name appeared in George's notebook, listed among Jacquelyn's former teachers. The entry read, English teacher sophomore year, track coach. Seemed concerned about E's disappearance. Lives alone on Redmond Street. Nothing suspicious. Nothing that warranted further attention. Just another name in a long list of people who'd intersected with Jacquelyn's life. Years accumulated like sediment. 1972 brought no answers. 1973 was equally silent. By 1975, even the sympathetic calls from strangers had stopped. The Maplewood Gazette no longer published Martha's letters, editors gently suggesting that without new developments, there wasn't much more to say. But Martha kept writing them anyway. She filled notebooks with letters that would never be sent, arguments that would never be heard, pleas for justice that echoed only in the emptiness of her own home. The isolation was crushing. Friends stopped visiting, uncomfortable with the Hayes family's inability to move on. Relatives suggested grief counseling, therapy, medication, anything to help Martha and George accept what they refused to accept. The community's compassion had limits, and those limits had been reached. In 1978, Detective Samuel Harris retired from the Michigan State Police. He'd closed dozens of cases during his career, but Jacquelyn's file remained open on his desk until his last day. He met with Martha and George one final time, apologizing for his failure, promising that someone would continue the investigation. But they all knew the truth. Without new evidence, without a break in the case, Jacquelyn would remain missing. The mystery would remain unsolved. Harris handed Martha a copy of the complete case file, something he wasn't supposed to do, but felt they deserved. She accepted it without comment, adding it to the archives in Jacquelyn's bedroom. The 1980s brought changes to Maplewood. The university expanded. New subdivisions replaced farmland on the town's edges. The generation that had known Jacquelyn as a real person, not just a story, aged and moved away. To younger residents, Jacquelyn Hayes was history, a cautionary tale their parents told, a reason to lock doors at night. Martha retired from teaching in 1985. She was 63 and exhausted. George's health had begun failing. Heart problems, the doctor said, though Martha knew it was more than that. You couldn't carry that much grief for that long without it taking a physical toll. They talked about leaving Maplewood, starting over somewhere Jacquelyn's absence wouldn't haunt every street corner. But leaving felt like abandonment, like they were giving up on their daughter. So they stayed, growing older in a house filled with memories and unanswered questions. In 1992, on the 22nd anniversary of Jacquelyn's disappearance, Martha placed a memorial notice in the Maplewood Gazette. It was brief. Jacquelyn Hayes, September 15, 1948, missing since September 22, 1970, beloved daughter, never forgotten. Justice delayed is not justice denied. That same year, David Bradford received recognition from the Maplewood School District for 30 years of dedicated service to education. He'd taught English to thousands of students, coached track and field teams to regional championships, sponsored the debate club and the literary magazine. His retirement party drew over 200 people, former students, fellow teachers, community leaders, all celebrating a man they saw as a pillar of their town. Bradford gave a short speech, thanking everyone for their support, expressing pride in the lives he'd touched through teaching. He never mentioned Jacquelyn Hayes. Why would he? He was just a concerned former teacher, one of many who'd been troubled by her disappearance decades earlier. The 90s passed. George Hayes died in 1998 of congestive heart failure, aged 76. He'd spent 28 years searching for answers about his daughter. He died without finding them. Martha continued alone. She was 76 years old, her health declining, her world reduced to the house on Sickerdale Avenue, and the files that documented a case everyone else had forgotten. She still wrote occasional letters to the Maplewood Police Department, though she no longer expected responses. In 2003, the department assigned a young detective named Lisa Brennan to review cold cases, looking for any that might benefit from advances in forensic technology. Jacquelyn's file landed on Brennan's desk. She read through the reports, studied the evidence logs, reviewed the witness statements. She found Harris's notes still tucked into the folder, his frustration evident in the increasingly terse entries as the investigation stalled. Brennan called Martha Hayes and asked to meet. They sat at Martha's kitchen table, the same table where Jacquelyn had done homework 33 years earlier, and talked about the case. Brennan made no promises. The evidence was old, the leads were dead, and without something new to pursue, there wasn't much she could do, but she promised to keep the file active. She promised Jacquelyn wouldn't be forgotten. It wasn't much, but it was something. Martha Hayes lived to see 2019. She was 97 years old when she passed away in her sleep, having spent 49 years fighting for her daughter. She died without knowing that technology was about to catch up to her determination, that the justice she'd demanded for half a century was finally within reach. If you think persistence doesn't matter, think again. Subscribe now, because what happens next proves that some fights are worth never giving up on, even when it takes 50 years to win. 50 years is a lifetime, long enough for technology to transform from primitive to revolutionary, long enough for a killer to believe he'd escaped justice permanently, long enough for a cold case to seem hopeless, but not long enough for science to forget. In 1970, when Jacquelyn Hayes disappeared, DNA analysis didn't exist as an investigative tool. The double helix structure had been discovered less than 2 decades earlier, and its application to criminal justice was still science fiction. Investigators relied on fingerprints, witness statements, physical evidence you could see and touch. If a killer left no visible trace, the case often died with the investigation. By 2020, everything had changed. Detective Lisa Brennan had kept Jacquelyn's file active since taking over cold cases in 2003. She'd reviewed it periodically, hoping for something, anything, that might provide a new angle. But the evidence remained stubbornly silent. DNA samples existed from Jacquelyn's apartment, collected during the original investigation and preserved in storage, but they'd never been analyzed because the technology hadn't existed when they were gathered. In January 2020, Brennan attended a conference on forensic genealogy. The technique had exploded into prominence 2 years earlier, with the arrest of the Golden State Killer, a case that had gone cold for decades before genetic genealogy cracked it wide open. The method was deceptively simple in concept. Take DNA from a crime scene, upload it to public genealogy databases, find relatives of the suspect, then build a family tree to identify the person responsible. Brennan returned to Maplewood with a plan. She submitted a formal request to have Jacquelyn's case samples analyzed using modern DNA extraction techniques. The samples were 50 years old, degraded by time and storage conditions, but advances in forensic science now allowed technicians to work with genetic material that would have been useless a decade earlier. The lab results came back in March. They'd successfully extracted a male DNA profile from material found in Jacquelyn's apartment. Not from Jacquelyn herself, but from an unknown individual who'd been there around the time she disappeared. The profile was partial but usable, containing enough genetic markers to potentially identify its source. Brennan uploaded the profile to GEDmatch, a public genealogy database where people voluntarily shared their genetic information to find relatives and trace family histories. The system searched for matches, looking for anyone whose DNA showed familial connections to the unknown profile from Jacquelyn's apartment. The results appeared within hours. A third cousin match, then a second cousin once removed, then others. Dozens of distant relatives whose genetic information created a map pointing back to a common ancestor. Brennan spent 3 weeks building family trees, working with a genetic genealogist to trace lineages forward through generations. The process was painstaking. Birth records, marriage certificates, death notices, census data, obituaries. Each document added another branch to the tree, narrowing the field of potential suspects. By April, they'd identified a family cluster in Michigan. The DNA profile from Jacquelyn's apartment belonged to someone descended from a couple who'd lived in Detroit in the 1890s. Their descendants had spread across the state, but one particular line remained concentrated in and around Maplewood. The trail led to a man named David Bradford, born in 1925, died in 1983. He'd had 3 children, One of them was David Bradford, former high school teacher, now 86 years old, living in a retirement community 40 miles from Maplewood. Brennan pulled David Bradford's file from the original investigation. He'd been interviewed briefly in October 1970 as someone who'd known Jacquelyn through the school system. The interview notes were sparse, cooperative, concerned, no red flags. Detective Harris had written, "Former teacher, respected in community, alibi weak but not impossible to verify. No reason to pursue further at this time." But now there was reason. Brennan needed a direct DNA sample to confirm the match. She couldn't simply arrest an 86-year-old man based on genetic genealogy alone. The science was too new, too untested in court. She needed definitive proof. In May 2020, as the world grappled with a pandemic, Brennan began surveillance on David Bradford. He lived in Pine Haven Retirement Community, a cluster of independent living units where elderly residents maintained their own apartments but had access to meal services and medical care. Bradford moved slowly now, using a cane, his once athletic frame bent by age. He seemed like any other elderly man living out his final years in quiet obscurity. Brennan waited for an opportunity. It came on May 18th when Bradford attended a community lunch. He drank from a disposable cup, then threw it in the trash. It was public refuse, legally obtainable, without a warrant. Brennan retrieved the cup, sealed it in an evidence bag, and sent it to the lab. The DNA results returned on June 3, 2020. Positive match. The profile from David Bradford's saliva was consistent with the unknown male DNA found in Jacquelyn Hayes' apartment 50 years earlier. The statistical probability of it being someone else was less than 1 in 10 trillion. After 5 decades, Jacquelyn's case finally had its answer. David Bradford, the respected teacher who'd shaped young minds for 30 years, who'd coached track teams and sponsored school clubs, who'd attended Jacquelyn's memorial service and expressed sorrow over her disappearance. He was the person responsible. He'd been there in her apartment. He'd been involved in whatever had happened to her that September night in 1970. The revelation hit the Maplewood Police Department like a seismic wave. Officers who'd grown up hearing about the Jacquelyn Hayes case, who'd known it as their department's greatest failure, now had to process that the killer had been walking among them for decades, that he'd lived freely, taught children, retired with honors, while Jacquelyn remained missing and her family suffered without answers. Brennan assembled a task force. They needed to move carefully. Bradford was elderly, potentially frail, and any misstep could compromise the prosecution. They reviewed the original case files with fresh eyes, looking for connections they'd missed 50 years earlier. They found them. Bradford had access to Jacquelyn. He'd taught her in 1963, when she was a 15-year-old high school sophomore. He would have known where she lived after she moved to Maplewood for college. The university was small, the town smaller. He could have tracked her without raising suspicion. The investigation revealed more. In 1969, a year before Jacquelyn disappeared, Bradford's wife had filed for divorce, citing emotional cruelty and controlling behavior. She'd left Maplewood and never returned. Friends from that era, now elderly themselves, remembered Bradford's personality changing after the divorce, becoming more isolated, more bitter, more fixated on perceived slights. But none of that explained why Jacquelyn. Why a former student who'd moved on with her life, who by all accounts had no ongoing contact with Bradford after high school? What had triggered him to target her specifically? The task force prepared for arrest. They coordinated with the prosecutor's office, assembled evidence packets, briefed the officers who'd make the arrest. Everything had to be documented. Everything had to be ironclad. Bradford had evaded justice for 50 years. He wouldn't slip away now. On July 15, 2020, Detective Lisa Brennan drove to Pine Haven Retirement Community with a warrant for David Bradford's arrest. She'd worked Jacquelyn's case for 17 years, knowing Martha Hayes had died without seeing justice, knowing George Hayes had searched until his final breath. This moment belonged to them. The killer who thought he'd gotten away with it was about to learn that time doesn't erase truth. it only delays it. Subscribe now, because the arrest that shook Maplewood to its core reveals just how long a monster can hide behind a trusted face. July 15th, 2020. Detective Lisa Brennan walked into Pine Haven Retirement Community carrying a burden 50 years in the making. Behind her, 2 uniformed officers. In her hand, an arrest warrant for David Bradford, 86 years old, former educator, suspected killer. The community coordinator led them to Bradford's unit, a small apartment overlooking a courtyard where other residents gathered for morning exercise. Through the window, Brennan could see elderly men and women moving through their routines, oblivious to what was about to happen in their midst. Bradford answered on the second knock. He stood hunched over his cane, wearing a cardigan despite the summer heat, his face creased with age but his eyes still sharp. When he saw the officers, something flickered across his expression, not surprise but recognition, as if he'd been waiting 50 years for this moment. Brennan identified herself and read him his rights. Bradford listened without interruption, then asked a single question. "How did you find me?" "DNA," Brennan answered. Bradford nodded slowly, almost admiringly. "Science," he said. "I should have known science would be the end of it." The arrest was quiet, dignified even. Bradford didn't resist. He didn't demand his lawyer. He simply asked if he could change into proper clothes before they took him to the station. Brennan agreed, standing in the doorway while he dressed, ensuring he had no opportunity to destroy evidence or harm himself. In the car, Bradford stared out the window as they drove through Maplewood. The town had changed enormously since 1970. New buildings, new roads, entire neighborhoods that hadn't existed when Jacquelyn Hayes disappeared. But the courthouse still stood on Main Street, the same building where Bradford had once served on a citizens' advisory committee for youth programs. News of the arrest spread within hours. The Maplewood Police Department held a press conference at 2 o'clock. Chief of Police Marcus Sutton stood at a podium, flanked by Detective Brennan and the county prosecutor, and announced that David Bradford had been arrested in connection with the 1970 disappearance of Jacquelyn Hayes. The room erupted. Reporters shouted questions. Cameras flashed. How certain were they? What evidence did they have? Had he confessed? Where was Jacquelyn's body? Sutton kept his answers measured. They had DNA evidence linking Bradford to the crime scene. The investigation was ongoing. They were confident in their case. He would not comment on confession or remains. But the real story wasn't happening at the press conference. It was happening in living rooms and coffee shops and church basements across Maplewood, where people who'd known David Bradford struggled to reconcile the man they remembered with the monster he'd apparently been. Former students called television stations, their voices shaking. Bradford had taught them to love literature, they said. He'd written college recommendation letters. He'd attended their weddings, sent cards when their children were born. How could the same hands that graded essays have harmed Jacquelyn Hayes? Patricia Collins, now 72 years old and living in Ohio, watched the press conference on her laptop. She'd left Maplewood decades earlier, unable to stay in a town where her best friend had vanished. When Bradford's face appeared on screen, she felt her stomach lurch. She remembered him from high school, Mr. Bradford, who taught sophomore English, who'd seemed kind, who'd praised Jacquelyn's essay on the Scarlet Letter. He'd known Jacquelyn. He'd taught her. And then, 7 years after she'd sat in his classroom, he'd made her disappear. The psychological weight of that realization crushed whatever innocence Maplewood had preserved. If David Bradford could be a killer, anyone could. The teacher who'd shaped your mind. The coach who'd trained you. The neighbor who'd waved from his porch. Evil didn't announce itself with warning signs. It wore familiar faces and spoke in trusted voices. Barbara Chen had been one of Bradford's students in 1985. She'd gone on to become a teacher herself, modeling her classroom management on techniques she'd learned from him. Now she was 67, retired, living in the house where she'd raised her children. When she heard about the arrest, she walked to her bookshelf and pulled down her old yearbook. There was Bradford's photo, younger, dark-haired, smiling at the camera beside a quote about education being the foundation of civilization. She threw the yearbook in the trash. The Maplewood School District released a statement expressing shock and offering counseling services to anyone traumatized by the news. They emphasized that Bradford had retired decades ago, that current safety protocols were far more rigorous, that today's students were protected by systems that hadn't existed in 1970. But those assurances rang hollow. Bradford hadn't been stopped by the system. He'd retired with honors, collected his pension, lived comfortably into old age while Jacquelyn's family suffered. The system had failed completely. At the county jail, Bradford sat in an interrogation room across from Detective Brennan. His lawyer, a public defender named Keith Morrison, had arrived within 3 hours of the arrest. Morrison advised Bradford to remain silent, to say nothing until they'd reviewed the evidence against him. Bradford ignored the advice. "I want to talk," he said. Morrison tried to intervene, but Bradford raised a hand, silencing him. "I'm 86 years old. I have nothing to lose now. Let me talk." Brennan activated the recording equipment and stated the date, time, and persons present. Then she asked the question that had haunted Maplewood for 50 years. What happened to Jacquelyn Hayes? Bradford looked at his hands, age-spotted, trembling slightly, the hands of an old man facing the end of everything. When he spoke, his voice was steady. "She rejected me," he said. "That's what happened." The statement hung in the air like poison gas. Brennan waited, knowing silence would draw out more than questions ever could. "I saw her again in 1970, Bradford continued. "At the university. She didn't remember me at first. I'd been just one teacher among many. But I remembered her. I'd always remembered her. She was special, you understand? Brilliant. Destined for greatness, I thought." He paused, searching for words. "I thought she'd recognize that we were meant to be together, that our connection transcended the usual boundaries." Morrison tried again to stop him. Again, Bradford waved him off. "I went to her apartment that night, September 21st. I told her how I felt, what I'd felt for years. She was horrified. She told me to leave. She threatened to report me. She didn't understand." His voice cracked. "She didn't understand that I loved her." Brennan kept her expression neutral, but inside, rage burned. This was the answer? A delusional obsession, a rejection, a man's inability to accept that his feelings weren't reciprocated? "What did you do then?" Brennan asked. Bradford met her eyes. "I made sure she couldn't tell anyone. I made sure she couldn't ruin my life over feelings I couldn't control." He didn't specify how, didn't explain what had happened to Jacquelyn's body or where it might be found. Just that vague, chilling admission. He'd made sure she couldn't tell. The interrogation continued for 3 more hours, but Bradford revealed nothing more of substance. He'd confessed to being responsible for Jacquelyn's disappearance, but refused to provide details that might lead to recovery of remains. As if holding that final piece of information gave him some remaining measure of control, news of Bradford's confession leaked within days. The details spread through Maplewood like a virus, infecting every memory people had of him. The beloved teacher was gone, replaced by a predator who'd fixated on a teenage student and waited years to act on his obsession. Jacquelyn's surviving relatives, cousins and second cousins, her parents long dead, released a statement through their attorney. They expressed relief that the truth had finally emerged, anger that justice had taken 50 years, and grief that Martha and George Hayes hadn't lived to see their daughter's killer arrested. The betrayal cut deepest for those who'd trusted Bradford most. His former students, now grandparents themselves, questioned everything they remembered. Had there been signs? Had other students been at risk? How many times had they left their children in his care, never suspecting what he was capable of? Maplewood had to reckon with an uncomfortable truth. They'd celebrated a killer. They'd honored him, thanked him for his service, sent him into retirement with plaques and parties while Jacquelyn Hayes remained missing, and her family suffered without answers. The trial was coming. More secrets would emerge. But the fundamental betrayal was already complete. 50 years of a killer living freely among those who'd trusted him, teaching their children, shaping their community, hiding behind the very respectability that should have protected his victims. If this shocks you, it should. Stay subscribed, because the trial reveals even darker truths about the man Maplewood thought they knew, and the woman whose life he stole. The trial of David Bradford began on October 12, 2020, in the Maplewood County Courthouse. The building had stood for over a century, witnessing countless cases, but none that had waited 50 years for resolution. Every seat in the courtroom was filled. Reporters lined the back wall. Outside, news vans from Detroit, Grand Rapids, and Chicago crowded the street. This wasn't just a trial. It was a reckoning. Prosecutor Margaret Feldman had spent 3 months preparing her case. She'd reviewed every document from the original 1970 investigation, interviewed everyone still alive who'd known Jacquelyn Hayes or David Bradford, and consulted with forensic experts about the DNA evidence that had finally cracked the case. Her challenge wasn't proving Bradford's guilt. His confession and the DNA match made that straightforward. Her challenge was making the jury understand the magnitude of what he'd done. Bradford entered the courtroom in a wheelchair, his cane inadequate for the distance from holding to the defense table. He wore a gray suit that hung loose on his diminished frame. His attorney, Keith Morrison, sat beside him, looking resigned. They both knew how this would end. Judge Victoria Reese called the court to order. She was 63, a former prosecutor who'd built her reputation on handling complex criminal cases. She'd studied Jacquelyn's file extensively, understanding that this trial carried weight beyond the individual crime. It represented justice delayed, a system failure finally being corrected. Feldman stood to deliver her opening statement. Her words were measured, deliberate, designed to cut through 50 years of distance and make Jacquelyn Hayes real to jurors who'd been born decades after her disappearance. Jacquelyn Hayes was 22 years old when David Bradford took her life, Feldman began. She was a medical student with a full scholarship. She wanted to be a doctor. She wanted to help people. On September 21, 1970, David Bradford went to her apartment and ended all of that because she refused his advances, because she said no to a man who believed his desires mattered more than her autonomy, more than her future, more than her life. She laid out the evidence systematically, the DNA match connecting Bradford to Jacquelyn's apartment, his confession to police, the timeline showing he had opportunity and motive, his history of controlling behavior, documented in his ex-wife's divorce filing, the testimony of former students who'd felt uncomfortable around him but never reported it because he was respected, because he was trusted, because who would believe a teacher could be dangerous? Morrison's defense strategy was simple: acknowledge guilt, but argue for leniency based on Bradford's age and the time elapsed. He painted a picture of a man who'd made a terrible mistake half a century ago, who'd lived with that guilt ever since, who posed no danger to society now. But Feldman destroyed that narrative in cross-examination. She brought forward Bradford's ex-wife, now 91 years old, testifying via video link from Arizona. Helen Bradford hadn't spoken to her former husband in over 50 years. Her testimony was damning. He was obsessed with control, Helen said, her voice thin but clear. Everything had to be his way. When I tried to leave the first time in 1968, he told me no one would believe me if I said anything bad about him. He said his reputation would protect him. He was right. Everyone loved him. The perfect teacher, the dedicated coach. They had no idea what he was really like. Feldman asked the critical question, "Did you ever suspect he might be capable of violence?" Helen paused, then nodded slowly. "I knew he was capable of anything if someone threatened his image. That's what mattered most to him, how people saw him, not who he actually was, but the version he'd created." The courtroom sat in heavy silence as her testimony ended. Next came the forensic evidence. Dr. Chen Wei, the genetic genealogist who'd helped identify Bradford through DNA analysis, explained how the science worked. She used charts and diagrams to show how Bradford's genetic profile matched the evidence from Jacquelyn's apartment, with a probability exceeding 10 trillion to 1. Morrison challenged the reliability of genetic genealogy, arguing it was too new, too untested. But Dr. Way's credentials were impeccable, her methodology sound. The science held. On the fourth day of trial, Bradford himself took the stand against his attorney's advice. He wanted to speak, he said. He wanted people to understand. Feldman approached him carefully, knowing she was questioning an elderly man who'd confessed to a decades-old crime. She needed to be precise without appearing to bully him. Mr. Bradford, when did you first develop feelings for Jacquelyn Hayes? Bradford considered the question. She was in my class in 1963, 15 years old, brilliant student. I recognized something special in her. Something special, Feldman repeated. What did that mean to you? That we shared an intellectual connection, that she understood literature the way I did, that someday when she was older, she'd recognize what we could be to each other. The answer chilled the courtroom. He'd been planning this for years, watching Jacquelyn grow up, waiting for his opportunity. Feldman continued, when you went to her apartment on September 21st, 1970, what did you intend to happen? I intended to tell her how I felt, to give her the chance to see we were meant to be together. And when she refused? Bradford's expression hardened. She didn't just refuse. She was cruel. She said I disgusted her. She said she'd report me to the university, to the police. She said I was delusional. She threatened to destroy my career, my reputation, everything I'd built. So you killed her. Morrison objected, but Bradford answered before the judge could rule. I defended myself. I defended my life's work. She left me no choice. The courtroom erupted. Judge Reese called for order, but the damage was done. Bradford had just admitted on the record that he'd valued his reputation more than Jacquelyn's life. Feldman pressed forward. Where is Jacquelyn's body, Mr. Bradford? I don't remember. You don't remember, or you won't say? Does it matter? She's gone. She's been gone for 50 years. Nothing changes that now. The callousness of his response sealed his fate. Whatever sympathy his age might have generated evaporated. This wasn't a remorseful old man seeking redemption. This was a killer who'd hidden successfully for decades and resented being caught. The prosecution rested after 6 days. Morrison called no witnesses beyond Bradford himself, knowing there was no defense that could overcome the evidence and his client's own words. Closing arguments took place on October 23rd. Feldman spoke for 40 minutes, methodically reviewing the evidence, the confession, the complete absence of remorse. She asked the jury to give Jacquelyn Hayes what she'd been denied for 50 years, justice. Morrison's closing was brief. He asked for mercy, citing Bradford's age and poor health. He suggested that imprisoning an 86-year-old man served no purpose beyond vengeance. The jury deliberated for 3 hours. They returned a verdict of guilty on all counts: second-degree murder, obstruction of justice, and tampering with evidence. The conviction carried a mandatory sentence of life in prison without possibility of parole. Judge Reese scheduled sentencing for November 5th, allowing time for victim impact statements to be prepared. The day of sentencing arrived gray and cold, winter announcing itself early. The courtroom filled again, though the crowd was smaller now, mostly family members and a few reporters. Patricia Collins had flown in from Ohio. She'd prepared a statement, though she wasn't sure she could deliver it without breaking down. When her turn came, she walked to the podium and looked directly at Bradford. You took my best friend, she said. You took someone who was going to change the world. Jacquelyn would have saved lives. She would have been an incredible doctor. Instead, she's gone, and you lived free for 50 years. You taught children. You were honored. You had a life while Jacquelyn had nothing. I'll never forgive you. I'll never understand how you could do this and just keep living as if nothing happened. Other statements followed. Cousins who'd never known Jacquelyn but carried their family's grief. Former classmates who'd wondered for decades what happened to the brilliant girl from their anatomy class. Community members who felt betrayed by the man they'd trusted. Finally, Judge Reese spoke. Her voice was firm, carrying the weight of 5 decades of injustice finally being corrected. David Bradford, you have been found guilty of taking the life of Jacquelyn Hayes and concealing that crime for 50 years. You showed no remorse. You blamed your victim for your actions. You demonstrated that even now, facing the consequences of your crime, you believe you were justified. The law allows me no discretion in sentencing. You will spend the remainder of your life in prison. But even if I had discretion, this is the sentence I would impose. Jacquelyn Hayes deserved to live. You took that from her. Now the law takes your freedom from you. Life in prison. No parole. No second chances. Bradford showed no reaction. He sat motionless in his wheelchair as bailiffs prepared to return him to custody. As they wheeled him from the courtroom, he looked once at the gallery, his expression unreadable. Then he was gone, disappearing into the justice system he'd evaded for half a century. Outside the courthouse, Patricia Collins stood with Jacquelyn's surviving relatives. They'd won, technically. The killer had been caught, convicted, sentenced, but the victory felt hollow. Martha and George Hayes had died without seeing this day. Jacquelyn's body had never been found. Bradford refused to provide that final piece of closure. Justice had come. But it came with the crushing knowledge that it could have come decades earlier if someone had looked harder, questioned more, trusted their instincts about the respected teacher who seemed just slightly too interested in his female students. The system had failed Jacquelyn Hayes in 1970. It had taken 50 years and revolutionary science to correct that failure. The trial was over. The sentence passed. But the questions lingered. How many other David Bradfords exist, hiding behind respectability, protected by trust, waiting to be exposed? When someone you trust betrays you in the worst way possible, is justice ever truly enough? Subscribe now for more true crime cases that expose the darkness hiding behind familiar faces, because the truth matters, even when it takes 50 years to surface. 50 years is long enough to lose hope. Long enough to watch everyone you love die waiting for answers. Long enough for a killer to believe he's won. But Jacquelyn Hayes' story proves that some truths refuse to stay buried, no matter how much time passes. David Bradford died in prison on March 7, 2022, at the age of 88. He served 16 months of his life sentence, never revealing where he'd hidden Jacquelyn's remains. His final act of control was denying her family the closure of bringing her home. To the end, he prioritized his own power over their pain. Jacquelyn's body has never been found. Search teams combed areas where Bradford had access in 1970. Wooded regions outside Maplewood, abandoned properties, construction sites that existed before development changed the landscape. Ground-penetrating radar, cadaver dogs, forensic archaeologists. Every tool available was deployed. Nothing. Patricia Collins organized a memorial service in Maplewood on September 22, 2021, marking 51 years since Jacquelyn disappeared. Over 300 people attended, most of them too young to have known Jacquelyn personally. They came because her story mattered, because justice delayed shouldn't mean justice forgotten. The service took place in the town square, where a bench now bears Jacquelyn's name and a plaque describing her life and aspirations. Patricia spoke about the friend she'd lost, the doctor Jacquelyn never became, the lives she could have saved if David Bradford hadn't decided his obsession mattered more than her future. Jacquelyn wanted to help people, Patricia said, her voice carrying across the silent crowd. She studied constantly, sacrificed social life for medical textbooks, pushed herself because she believed saving lives was the highest calling. Instead, her life was taken. But her legacy isn't just tragedy. It's persistence. It's the refusal to let murder be the final word. The Jacquelyn Hayes case transformed how law enforcement approaches cold cases. The success of genetic genealogy in identifying Bradford prompted police departments across Michigan, and eventually nationwide, to re-examine unsolved cases with preserved DNA evidence. Dozens of investigations that had gone cold for decades suddenly had new life. The Michigan Cold Case Unit expanded in 2021, adding forensic genealogists and DNA analysts specifically to pursue cases similar to Jacquelyn's. Families who'd spent years without answers began receiving calls about breakthroughs, arrests, convictions. The technology that caught Bradford became a tool for justice on a scale no one had anticipated. Detective Lisa Brennan retired in 2023 after 32 years with the Maplewood Police Department. Jacquelyn's case defined her career, she said, not because solving it was particularly complex, but because it represented what persistence and evolving science could accomplish. She'd worked the case for 20 years before the breakthrough came. She never stopped believing answers existed. In her retirement speech, Brennan addressed families still waiting for justice. Don't give up. Technology advances. Methods improve. What seems impossible today might be routine tomorrow. Your loved one's case might be one DNA upload away from resolution. Keep pushing. Keep demanding answers. You owe them that. The Hayes family legacy continues through the Jacquelyn Hayes Foundation, established by Patricia Collins and Jacquelyn's surviving cousins. The foundation provides financial support to families navigating cold case investigations, covering costs for DNA testing, private investigators, legal fees that often prevent families from pursuing justice. Since 2021, they've assisted 43 families across 12 states. Martha and George Hayes didn't live to see David Bradford arrested, convicted, sentenced. They died without knowing the truth, without seeing justice served. That failure haunts everyone involved in the case. But their decades of advocacy, their refusal to let Jacquelyn be forgotten, created the pressure that kept the investigation alive long enough for science to catch up. Their story proves that families matter in cold cases, that publicity matters, that refusing to accept unsolved as final matters. If Martha Hayes had stopped writing letters, if George Hayes had stopped talking to strangers at the diner, if they'd accepted what everyone told them, that Jacquelyn was gone and answers weren't coming, David Bradford might have died peacefully in his retirement, his secret intact. Instead, he died in prison, exposed as the monster he'd hidden for 50 years. Jacquelyn's case also sparked conversations about power dynamics in education, about how authority figures exploit trust, about the systems that protect predators by assuming respectability equals safety. Bradford taught for 30 years after killing Jacquelyn. How many students felt uncomfortable around him but said nothing because he was respected? How many warning signs were dismissed because no one wanted to believe a beloved teacher could be dangerous? Those questions matter. They force institutions to examine how they vet employees, how they respond to complaints, how they balance reputation protection against student safety. Jacquelyn's death happened in 1970, but the lessons remain current. The Maplewood School District now requires annual background checks for all staff, maintains anonymous reporting systems for concerning behavior, and conducts regular trainings on recognizing predatory patterns. Other districts across Michigan adopted similar policies, citing Jacquelyn's case as justification. Change came too late for Jacquelyn, but it might save someone else. On what would have been Jacquelyn's 75th birthday, March 3, 2023, Patricia Collins visited the memorial bench bearing her friend's name. She brought flowers and sat for an hour, remembering the girl who'd wanted to be a doctor, who'd studied cardiovascular systems and dreamed of surgical residencies, whose future had been stolen by a man who believed his feelings justified violence. "We got him, Ellie," Patricia said quietly. "It took 50 years, but we got him." Justice for Jacquelyn Hayes came late. It came after her parents died. It came without recovering her remains. It came in a courtroom where the killer showed no remorse, where he blamed his victim for forcing his hand. But it came, and that matters. Every cold case represents a family living in limbo, unable to grieve properly because questions remain unanswered. Jacquelyn's case proves those questions can eventually be answered, that killers who think they've escaped can still be caught, that time doesn't erase truth, it only tests how hard people are willing to fight for it. If Jacquelyn's story moves you, if you believe justice matters even when it takes decades, then remember the families still waiting for answers. Share their stories, support organizations working to solve cold cases, advocate for funding forensic genealogy programs. Vote for officials who prioritize justice over budget concerns. Subscribe to stay connected to stories like Jacquelyn's, cases where persistence overcame obstacles, where families refused to give up, where justice finally prevailed. Because these stories aren't just about tragedy. They're about the refusal to accept that tragedy gets the last word. Jacquelyn Hayes deserved to live. She deserved to become the doctor she'd worked so hard to be. David Bradford took that from her, but he couldn't take her legacy, the changes her case inspired, the families it helped, the proof it provided that some fights are worth continuing even when hope seems lost. 50 years from disappearance to justice, a lifetime of waiting. But in the end, the truth emerged. The killer faced consequences, and Jacquelyn's name became synonymous not with victimhood, but with the power of persistence against seemingly impossible odds. That's the legacy worth remembering. That's the story worth telling. And that's why cases like Jacquelyn's demand our attention, because justice delayed is painful, but justice achieved, no matter how late, proves that some truths refuse to stay hidden forever. Make sure you're subscribed for more cases that prove the truth always matters, even when it takes decades to surface. Only subscribers get the complete story of how justice prevails against the odds. Don't miss the next investigation that shows why giving up is never an option when someone's life has been stolen and their family deserves answers.